So, the title of this meeting was COP26, What's Next? We're trying to answer this question of why capitalism can't be green, and how to build a successful movement to save the environment. And, of course, this is going to have to come up against the capitalist relations of production, which are causing climate catastrophe. So what I wanted to do with this talk was really get into COP26, the conference that happened in earlier this year. Just what was it, who was behind it, what was supposed to happen as a result, and what did actually happen, and how does that relate to what needs to happen. So COP26 was the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, the 26th annual summit of this type. The UK was the president, and the summit took place in Glasgow. So just to point out that this was a summit, which is in our times, this word means it's a meeting of the global bourgeoisie and the leaders of imperialist nations. And this was very true at COP. It was all about the world leaders of the most powerful countries turning up, or not turning up in some cases, whereas indigenous communities and underdeveloped countries were outnumbered 2-1 by lobbyists for fossil fuel companies, which were registered as part of country NGO or direct corporate delegations. So there's also this big, commercial element to the summit, which again is not unusual as a very big component of sort of global finance, which is interested in directing the management of a capitalist economy. And this is at root an economic question, right? The environment crisis is going to require huge changes to the way that things are produced in the world, and so this is why they're there. So I wanted to just draw out a few sponsors of this COP conference to point out the vested interests behind the summit. Firstly, we have Unilever. Unilever is a principal partner of COP, and its CEO from the last 10 years also had a personal role at the conference. And where to begin with Unilever? They're a giant sort of consumer goods multinational monopoly, centered in the city of London, like a lot of the other of these companies. And just as one example, they're profiting from palm oil plantations in Nigeria and West Papua. So can we really expect the conference to come out with an agreement to halt deforestation when one of the sponsors is a company that's profiting from deforestation? So another sponsor is Sainsbury's. Sainsbury's, obviously, this sort of supermarket chain in Britain, which has made a lot of its money from being able to import very cheap food from nations oppressed by imperialism. Nations that have been forced into unequal terms of trade, and sort of forced into growing monocrops, which has led to soil erosion, leads to heavy use of pesticides and fertilizers and a lot of other pollution. It leads to and it also means that any farmers that are working on these kind of products are completely at the whim of one company over the other side of the world. And so when demand plummets like it did in March 2020, that caused these huge economic shockwaves to the detriment of farmers in places like Latin America and Africa, whereas Sainsbury's was still making record profits. Sainsbury's also sells produce from Palestinian land, occupied Palestinian land by Israel. So Sainsbury's sells produce from Israel, and not only is the Palestinian struggle for self-determination a sort of humanitarian struggle for sovereignty and against sort of imperialist interests, but it's also a struggle for an ecological society. With the occupation of Palestinian land, it means it's often been used as a dump. Israel's often used it as a dumping ground for heavy industry and sewage. They'll literally build settlements on the tops of hills and just pipe the sewage down off the top of the hill to where the Palestinians have been displaced to. Israel has also got rid of a lot of native woodland and olive groves and put a lot of just sort of imported a lot of pine trees in particular, and so that's another sponsor. And then finally we've got NatWest. So I mean, I can say no more about NatWest, but they are one of the banks with less investment in fossil fuels than other banks in Britain, but they still have a $2 billion investment in fossil fuels. So not exactly the kind of person you want funding your conference on climate change, which surely is going to require us to reduce consumption of fossil fuels. So these interests are directly opposed to any kind of progressive outcome to the conference. And then, so beyond this sort of like business side of who was there was also the global finance arm. And I mean, the real symbol of this was Mark Carney. So he, until recently, was the governor of the Bank of England. But now he's the UN Special Envoy on Climate and Finance. But that's also not his only job. So, he was the finance advisor for the conference, and he is the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, which handles investments of $625 billion. So his commitment to finance capital long predates and far outweighs his brief for climate action. This is the guy that the US, the UN and Britain have sort of put their weight behind and said that he's an important... He can decide what goes on at the conference, financially speaking. And as an example of the kind of financial schemes that have come out of these summits, you should really look back at... There's an article from a recent issue of our paper titled Green Capitalism in Crisis, which looks into carbon credits and state subsidies of fossil fuel industry. And they haven't solved the problem. Carbon credits were introduced several years ago, and yet pollution has continued to increase. Certain industries are exempt from even having to worry about them, and also, if they're profitable enough, it's a drop in the ocean kind of thing. They're nowhere near the rates that would actually be required to stop these companies from polluting at all. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about the outcomes of COP26. So I'm going to draw on this slogan that the Downing Street press office used to lay out its plan for the conference. What it thought was most important, or what it hoped to get out, was cash, cars, coal and trees. Those were the four things that it thought were problems to be solved at the conference. Cash, meaning the international financial system, is of course the ultimate driver of the continued plundering of the natural world in the name of profit. So I'd struggle to see what they could do to, unless they were talking about dismantling that entire system, which I really doubt. This focus on cars is, obviously cars are, they are the cause of sort of a lot of personal individual consumption of fossil fuels, but it also is implying this sort of quite consumerist critique of climate change, as though that climate change is caused by individual people choosing to pollute due to choosing to use certain technology, and that if they have the choice to use a different technology, then everything's okay. Coal is the dirtiest fossil fuel when burnt. Again, it really needs to be cut down how much we use, but it hasn't yet. And trees, well, deforestation is an ongoing environmental crisis. It's having terrible effects on biodiversity, ecological sustainability, and CO2 drawdown. So clearly, issues that need tackling, I think particularly the last two. So which of these sort of Downing Street objectives had a happy ending, though? Which ones had any sort of significant agreement reached, or any progressive outcome that could actually get towards solving the identified problem? Well, I'm going to go through some of them now. So on the cash side of things, 450 financial institutions with assets worth $130 trillion agreed that, and you've got to listen carefully to the wording here, all their managed assets will be aligned with net zero emissions by 2050. So in other words, there's no specific immediate commitments to divest from fossil fuels, which is clearly what is needed. That's the action that these institutions must take if they do actually want to halt emissions. This target of net zero by 2050 is really easy to break, very hard to measure, and also far too far in the future for it to really save what is a vitally urgent problem today. Secondly, coal. The coal agreement. So a lot of countries, including UK, have already pledged to stop overseas financing of coal plants. At this COP, 18 countries signed a pledge to phase out domestic use of coal. And so this was really a very failed sort of agreement. Just 18 countries, it was mainly small users of coal. And again, it's this phasing out sort of phrasing, not just saying we're going to do it tomorrow. It's we're going to do it by the 2030s for major economies and the 2040s for the rest of the world. So, Poland was one example I remember that has signed this agreement, but it's counting itself as, that it's going to phase out its use of coal by the 2040s. And as doesn't, not been signed up for by many of the major consumers of coal, so pretty much a failure. And going back to this point about overseas financing of coal plants, so there's almost too much of a focus on coal. It's being treated as though just because it's the most polluting, it's the one that is kind of like a legitimate target, but then other fossil fuels are not being talked about. So firstly, this overseas financing of coal plants, it only applies to public funds, so private financial institutions like banks can still invest in coal. UK based banks can still do that. And it doesn't apply to like gas. So Britain, as in just earlier this year, invested in a gas export terminal in Mozambique using British state funds. And there've been a lot of pledges in the past around coal, and you can just look at whether they've had any effect. I mean, coal use alone was 4% higher in the last quarter of 2020 than the last quarter of 2019, globally that is. And then there's a UN report at the end of 2020 which found nations are planning production increases of coal, oil, and gas of 2% a year. So this, these kind of like predictions are obviously way above the targets that governments have set. Even these kind of lip service, very easy to achieve targets, I'd say, they're not even keeping to those, and they're definitely not anywhere near production decreases that are needed if we want to halt further global heating. The third agreement, cars. This really was a similar story to how the coal agreement turned out. A few manufacturers and a few nations have agreed to stop producing fossil fuel engines by 2040. And, let's bear in mind that that's probably, the deal has probably been sweetened by the fact they know they're going to get lots of these sort of net zero emissions investments from the financial institutions I mentioned earlier. But that cash is going to subsidise sort of quote unquote green industrial machinery, so like big battery factories, things like that. And even this transition to electric vehicles would be very damaging for the environment. It would require a continued plunder of lithium, of cobalt, things like that. And so this deal, it just sort of treats it as though it's a technological problem to be fixed. It doesn't examine the structural causes of modern society's dependence on the personal motor vehicle. For example, they didn't pledge any money for more public transport. That might have been a better solution, just to say, hey, these manufacturers should stop producing all these individual cars in this very wasteful way, and instead have transition to a more collective form of transport. But that's not what's going to come out of a climate conference dominated by monopolies and imperialist powers. And finally, trees. There was no significant agreement on trees. Like I say, some of the sponsors literally profit from deforestation. What do you expect? And there's also, the fact that Bolsonaro, the leader of Brazil, he's often sort of blamed for deforestation, even though it was happening long before he took office. And although it is true that he has sort of turned more of a blind eye to it, perhaps, than previous leaders of Brazil. But it's important to point out that the UK actually supported Bolsonaro's election. If you've ever heard of the Cambridge Analytica scandal a couple of years ago, which was, the focus in the press was on sort of Facebook data being used to target ads for elections in Britain, like the Brexit vote, and also the election of Donald Trump. But there wasn't so much fuss made over the fact that Cambridge Analytica also partnered with Bolsonaro's campaign in Brazil. They knew it was in the interest of sort of the British economy to help him get elected. So it's not surprising then that no agreement came out of this conference, when that's the kind of thing that the British state has been doing over the past several years. So I really wanted to drive home this point that we can't trust these pledges that have been made at the climate summits. Or to put it another way, why should we? Why should we? So many have been broken. Fossil fuel usage and CO2 emissions have continued to rise year on year. I mean, we're talking as far back as 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, I'm sure many of you have heard of. That was sort of the first of these summits that produced a pledge package, a sort of policy agreement. But what changed as a result of the Kyoto Protocols? It's been very easy for countries to ignore the targets or to push them back. Famously, Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement when he took office a few years ago. Is that simple? Is that simple for just sort of at the drop of a hat? The largest economies actually have no sort of accountability to keep to these pledges. And this really comes to the fact that there is no popular movement against the climate crisis. There's no mass movement that is demanding that these targets are kept to and that pollution is decreased. So things like UN summits and these Green New Deal policies that we often hear talked about are, they're easily broken promises. They're basically window dressing for an intensification of state monopoly capitalism. Any kind of announcements of subsidies are essentially sort of, stimulating new branches of industry. They're stimulating an increase in production. The subsidies are there to kind of kickstart what is the capitalists' hope will be very profitable in the future. So finally, I wanted to end on this point about kind of trying to link up this question of climate change with other questions with other problems facing so many people today. We've been on the streets talking to people about the climate crisis, finding people who want to do something about it. And we get a lot of people as well who sort of have different opinions to us, different answers. I mean, some people just deny it, say that it's not a problem, it's being made up to scare us. I'll leave that one there. I mean, some people sort of say that it's in the hands of God to change these things and there's nothing we can do. Some say that it's in the hands of the House of Commons, that institution can answer these questions that it's really helped to cause over the past couple centuries. And some say it's in the hands of science, of technology, that the kind of human spirit has got us into this mess and it'll get us out of it by inventing something. But to be a communist, you have to be a materialist. You have to see that class struggle is the motor of history here. The sort of dispossession that comes along with environmental damages, it is tied up to the fact that there is a massive working class globally that is kind of forced into this situation of being totally reliant on wages to get by every day. and not really having much sort of self-determination when it comes to things like where a dam is being built, or pollution happening upriver from where you live. So even in the context of these climate summits, oppressed nations with a strong anti-imperialist political trend have led the way. So Bolivia, for example, has convened its own climate summit in the Cochabamba summit, and really sort of made, as also at the UN summits has pointed out, that the question of sort of sustainability and equality has to start with getting rid of structural adjustment loans and ending third world debt. And it's been completely ignored. That's never been brought up by these sort of masters of global finance that are present at the summits. And even in Britain, it is the working class who pays for climate change. If you look at the statistics about air pollution, it lines up with the areas of a city that are most deprived in other ways as well, like have the least access to healthcare or the worst housing. Here in Birmingham, we've just had a congestion charge introduced, which is essentially, a bit of a revenue-raising activity for the city council that's, of course, disproportionately affecting those who are least able to afford it. If you've got a nice, clean, less polluting sort of modern car, or even an electric car, you could still afford a congestion charge, but instead it's the people who are sort of relying on an older second-hand vehicle that are then getting whacked. The poor are being priced out of this brave green new world of electric cars. It's very much a sort of preserve of the middle class, I guess, here in Britain. So, it's making this point that the struggle for a sustainable economy cannot be separated from the struggle for self-determination, which, means on a national scale in nations like Bolivia, but also on a local scale in Britain. The struggle for land and the struggle for healthcare are tied up with the environment crisis. Today's working class in Britain has inherited a world already ravaged by capitalism's ruthless and short-sighted exploitation. So, any kind of mass movement of the working class has to formulate demands to not only do away with this disruptive drive for profit, which has, caused all these problems and is causing daily so many problems, but it's also a question of repairing the damage already done to the planet. I mean, just to one example from a petition that we use is talking about sustainable agriculture, growing and rearing what this country needs to eat. And Cuba shines the way on this, which you can read more about in our paper about Cuba's sort of organic farming techniques. So, I wanted to end really with this quote from Chico Mendes, I believe, who said that ecology without class struggle is just gardening. Thanks for listening.